Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your time for today's session, and I hope you'll find this session informative. So let's get started. The topic for today is how to write a user story. So I'll quickly run through the agenda items for today. So we'll start off with the genesis of a user story, what it was before a user story, and what what led to user story creation. Then we'll talk about the requirement model. Sujit will take you through the requirement models based on the features, effects, and the user stories. And from then on, we'll talk about the elements that make up a good user story. Then the other item that on our agenda is the I'm sorry, I just had a choking incident a couple of minutes ago, so I might cough in between. Please excuse me for that. We'll talk about how to generate user stories using few of the techniques. The techniques that we are targeting today are user role modeling. We'll look into personas. We'll talk about story mapping. We'll talk about how to do impact mapping to generate better user stories. So that will be the crux of today's session. And from there, we'll move on to the anti-patterns that we typically find while we write user stories. So these are the topics that will be covered in today's session. At any given point in time, you have any questions, please feel free to write in the chat window or just raise your hand. Alok will help us navigating through the questions. Okay, so let's get started with the first topic. So we all know how it was before the user stories. I don't know, I'm sure some of you all would have worked in the traditional waterfall model wherein we used to write huge requirements, lengthy and nested requirements, and they used to be humongous. And there used to be a time when it could get really boring and tedious to go through these requirements, especially when it gets to the developers. We assume that they read through every line that's been written by the product team, and then they build accordingly, right? And during this entire process, the intent was to gather as much as information as possible upfront and do as much as detailing upfront and make the requirements intact. And while doing so, we also had an intent like capturing everything that's needed for the requirement, and then along the way, passing it on to another team, the development team, and they're putting their own perspective, making annotations and coming up with functional specs. And this back and forth used to happen. The requirement document used to undergo change. And while doing all of this, the clock used to tick away. And what used to happen? By the time you got to delivering the product, or by the time you delivered the product, the team, the customers would have something else in mind. And that would have led you all to change in scope, or what we call a scope creep. I would come back with some kind of a rework. So all of this was happening before user stories came into picture. Now, the intent was just to write the requirement there. And to move away from all of these practices, to shift the mindset, we had the user stories come into picture. So user stories helped us to move away from all these things that we just discussed. So what happens in a user story? So unlike the requirements documentation in the past, wherein the intent was to capture the requirements, that was the entire goal, just to capture all the requirements. The intent for a user story was not to capture the requirements alone, but then to capture requirements, but the intent was to solve the user needs. That was the whole intent. Along with that, these requirement documents in the past made it look like a contract and made it look like a final document. Whereas the user stories, as soon as you would find a requirement, you would only tag the details. You would just tag the functionality, and the focus was to defer the details and capture just enough information. And the focus also was to have more communication around the tagged functionality. So you tag the functionality, you come together with the product team, the developers, you have your communications, face-to-face communication, and then you enrich your user story. That's the whole concept of a user story. By doing so, you're encouraging a participative design. Also, you're encouraging feedback from the customers or customer stakeholder, customer-facing representatives who are part of these conversations. So these kind of user stories or simple requirements that we write also supported our iterative development that we're using in our agile ways of working. And iterative development, as we all know, says that probably we might go wrong at the beginning, but then eventually we'll make it right. The same concept applies to the user story also. You tag, you put just enough information, you have your conversation, you modify it, you enrich your story, and then you move on. So the whole focus was to solve the problem, to solve the customer needs, to have just incise requirement, just enough information. Do not go for upfront detailing of the requirements in agile ways of working. So that's how it led us to the concept of user stories. And as the word suggests, stories are all about conversations. I would say, yeah, communications. Yeah, talking about a particular user, talking about a particular character, what kind of problems the character has, what's the solution he's looking for, what kind of pain points, or what is that needs to be changed. These kind of things all have to be encompassed within a requirement, and that's how a user story came into picture. So having talked about the genesis of a user story, let me take you to the next topic, and I would request my colleague Sujit to take it over from me for this particular topic. Sujit, over
Thank
to
you
you.
so much, Sudha. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Sujit.
All right. So, everyone, thank you so much for joining. And when you talk about agile or when you talk about any project, right, we get requirements with which is different in size, right? So let me walk you through how requirements are structured with respect to size or with respect to the delivery time we take in teams in agile. So when I talk about an epic, an epic is the largest business requirement which you get, right? Uh, when you talk about, let me give you an analogy here. When you talk about a 3 BHK house, what comes to your head? What comes in your mind? Of course, there's 3 bedrooms, there's one hall, there's one kitchen, right? So this 3 BHK talks about your requirement maybe when you want to buy a house, and it talks about the major components or major modules in your application or in your house. So at that level, when you talk about when you talk about a product, let's take Amazon as an example. When you think of Amazon, right? So there are certain big or higher level modules which come into your head, right? Which is part of your customer journey. Let's take Amazon. First, a user will have to maybe onboard onto Amazon, maybe log in, register, whatever. Then there is browse product section where a lot of features, lot of capabilities are available. Then there's cart management. Again, there are a lot of capabilities within that. Then comes your payment, right? After payment is done, there's tracking of your delivery, reverse, refund, and everything, right? So when you talk about a customer journey, which I just mentioned for Amazon, each and every phase eventually becomes an epic for us. So that is a huge requirement which I'm talking about, right? I've given an example here of payment. So when I spoke about Amazon, payment was after maybe cart management. It is a phase of a customer journey in your product itself, right? Which has a significant amount of business value added to it. Usually, epics last over months, or sometimes they don't even get close because there's more and more innovation happening over certain modules. This is the highest level of requirement in Agile. Then comes your features, right? Features are nothing but capabilities which your product should provide or which you think the product should provide. Let's take a small analogy and then compare with Amazon. When I spoke about 3 BHK, let's take one bedroom at a time. We came into the bedroom. Now we spoke about what all capabilities should the bedroom have. It should have windows. It should have your wardrobes. It should have a space to put your bed. It should have a space to put your almiras, shoe racks, whatever, right? So now you're coming one layer down to talk about capabilities which you can think of. Again, in Amazon example here, when you talk about payments, now there are several types of payment which you can cater to your users. Certain set of users prefer cash on delivery. Certain set of users prefer net banking. Certain early adopters or who are digitally savvy, tech savvy, they go with UPI payment, right? So now you're talking about what all capabilities can we give under payments as a module, right? Those becomes your features. Usually teams take around sprints, multiple sprints, or even multiple weeks to deliver it in terms of delivery time. The third layer, which is also a topic of today, is the user story itself. When you talk about capabilities, there are a lot of actions which a user or an end user or a persona can do. For example, if you take UPI payment, as a user, as a consumer, I can pay via Google Pay. As a consumer, I can pay via phone pay. Now we are talking about all the user actions within that capability, which is nothing but your user stories. Usually we recommend teams to complete user story within 2-3 days or days in a sprint. So this is the hierarchy of the requirement or requirement model in Agile. Over to you, Sudha.
Thank you, Sujit. So you just heard about the requirement model, something that is really huge in a nutshell, which Sujit just explained, which takes about months to finish, or an entire release to finish, or maybe goes beyond a release, an epic, and then it comes down to feature, and then it comes down to user story. So we are going to talk about user story now. So what makes what is the composition of a user story? I'm not going to talk in detail about the different aspects of a user story and how to write a beautiful user story, because we had covered it in the previous webinar, but I would like to just broach over this particular topic. So Sujit, could you move on to the next slide? So what makes a good user story? A user story is a requirement, in a nutshell, from picking up from where Sujit left, is something that can be delivered within an iteration. Now, what is an iteration? It could be a week's iteration, could be 2 weeks iteration, duration of 2 weeks, or a 3-week iteration. But basically, when you're writing a user story, you should remember that it should be completed within that particular sprint or that particular iteration. So when you write a user story, it should be a simple requirement, which is customer centric. That's a user story. A requirement which is customer centric, which solves the customer problem, is a user story, right? It has 3 parts to it. So a simple template that you can follow to write a user story is what you see on the screen. It should have 3 parts: as a persona or as a user, because it's solving somebody's problem. Whose problem is it solving, or who are you targeting? That's the first part of it. What is that user? What is it that the user is looking forward to? The user wants to make a payment through a phone pay so that he's able to purchase a book from Amazon, so that he's able to purchase a book after making the payment. So that's the purpose that we're talking about. The crux of the entire user story is the purpose, right? So these are the 3 parts that you must bear in mind when you're writing a user story. Now, you see an example below. We talked about a customer who wants to make a credit card, information to be stored, so that his checkout is easier. So you see these options nowadays on e-commerce website, a small tick box which says, okay, save my information, so that when you get out, it just takes away the stored information, makes your life easier. So that's the template that we typically use for a user story. And many of the times, in my experience, I've noticed that people miss out the first part and the last part. I want my credit card information to be stored, because they feel that developers know what to develop, and the crux or the beauty of the story is lost, because we're not talking about the users here. The picture on the right hand side talks about an ALM tool depiction. In a typical ALM tool like a Jira that you see, a story, once it's recreated, it gets an ID, and every story has a unique identifier. The 3 parts of the user story is what you've seen there. Acceptance criteria, the conditions of criteria, a story that should meet to ensure or to make sure that the story has been implemented accordingly. That's the acceptance criteria that should be captured there. How high, what kind of importance or what kind of priority levels the story has. What is the estimate of the story? If you're using a story points, what's the size of the story? And then what kind of a type it is. Okay. You see the small check boxes there. So this is minimum information that you would want to have in a user story. Again, as I've previously mentioned, when we moved away from the requirements documentation phase, the traditional ways, we talked about tagging a functionality. Tagging a functionality is just enough information should be captured. And what is the just enough information? The user that we're targeting, and what does the user want, and what kind of purpose does it solve? This is the minimum information that must be there in a user story to call as a good user story. Now, there are other areas that we have to bear in mind when you're writing a user story. User stories are communication tools, right? If you could move on to the next slide, please, Sujit. So they say that you use the story, you capture the just enough information needed while using the techniques that we're going to talk about. And then over a conversation or over a face-to-face communication or a workshop that you're having with your product management team or customer-facing stakeholders, you build the requirement. So it's more about conversation over documentation. And that's why I said talk and doc. And confirmation is, this is a must. As I said, set of conditions a user story must meet so that the user knows it's implemented correctly. How do you know that a user story of credit card information, the example that we talked about, has been implemented correctly? You would want a window to be popped up, or you would want some kind of message to pop up, or something should happen. Some kind of an action should come up to say that, yeah, these things that I've captured in my requirement have been implemented correctly, and this is my functionality. That is a confirmation that is needed within a user story. Again, for a good user story, you must have these elements in place. Again, we've spoken about invest plenty of times in our previous webinar, but I'll just touch upon it. Every user story, as I've started off with, should fit within an iteration. That means it should be completed within an iteration, no matter how small or big an iteration is, a week's time or a 2 weeks time. So that is small enough. Every user story should be testable. So when we capture the acceptance criteria or the conditions of criteria, the QA should be able to test it. Now, why is there an emphasis on the testable element? Many times we see that developers build some stories and say, okay, this functionality is running. Take a look at the screen. But is it testable? No, probably when we build the other story, on top of it, we can combine together and the testing can be done in a later phase. Then how do you say a user story is complete when you've not even seen whether it's accomplished the goal or not? So ensure some way you test the user story. Again, when you write a user story, if you take up a user story and write it, you put some set of conditions. I want to make a payment to buy this purchase through a Google Pay, right? How big is the user story? How many people do we have in our team? Can we complete the building and testing right in one sprint? That's the question you need to ask. That is small enough, that is testable. And yes, if that's the case, this is probably a size of 2. It can be delivered in 3 to 4 days, including the testing areas. Or it could be a 5-story point, or it could be like a story size of medium or large. So, etc., etc. So you should be able to tell the size of the story or estimate the size of the story when you look at the story. Again, that leads to the same conversation. If you're unable to estimate it, that means you've written too much. It's not small enough. Again, if you make it like a contract, stringent, very tight, then it becomes non-negotiable. If somebody wants to make a change, you'll have to probably do some rework or write another story. So it should be negotiable. You should have those kind of conversations when you look at a user story to capture some more information. Again, many of the times, as I explained in the previous example, you'll find the stories are interdependent. I want to build one story. Story A is dependent on story B, but I want story A to be completed first. But for that to happen, B has to be completed. B is large and we can't, it's of a lesser priority. Now, how do we deal with such kind of information? Ensure that you make stories independent. You don't want stories which are dependent. When the stories become dependent, prioritization becomes difficult. When something goes wrong to story A, story B is also bound to take an effect because of the failure of story A. So try, I'm not saying ensure your stories are independent. Sometimes you cannot make them independent, but reduce the dependency among the stories is the crux of this particular point. So that's the invest criteria that one must ensure it's there in a user story. Again, the point to be noted is not everything is possible in a user story. At least it should be small. Small also, yeah, sometimes you feel that it can go to another sprint. It's all right, but we want it to be testable and at least independent. That should be a criteria. So choose those areas to make it a good story, right? There are a few other pointers that I'd like to bring to you to ensure the story or to figure out if a story is a good story. Capture just enough information. That's the point we've been talking all about. include a user role as a persona, as a user. It's the important point for a user story. So do not miss out on that particular point. Along with that, target to use a single user for a user story. So we'll talk more about users in our next slide. But then if you have multiple users for Amazon, like students or housewives or probably B2B clients, for every user, try to have a user story. If there are multiple users who are going to use the same functionality, it will become really complicated, or it becomes very difficult to read through a requirement. So target to have single user for a user story. Along with that, you should remember that this should be a placeholder. So if you identified user stories using in your story writing sessions, or when you're doing a discovery session, don't put in all the information there. Create a placeholder and put it in your backlog. Create future sprints like sprint 14, 15, 16, and wherever it's needed, drop them there. And then when you get there, just when the time is right and you think you're going to pick it up, add more detail to it. Okay, so that it stands as a reminder for you that something will evolve in future. Again, who should write the stories is always the question. It's always a collaboration which is needed. I would not want to say product owner must write. Yes, it is product owner's responsibility. Product is product owner's baby, right? So you'd expect the product owner to seek information and then write a user story. Sometimes you also see technical development team members writing stories. If they're doing it, they know the product, or they domain very well, fine, but then avoid any technical jargon. The implementation part or the technical activity should be left out of the user stories. Now, user stories should also capture constraints. Okay, this particular feature that I'm developing, which should be able to accept a Google Pay payment, should work on all Windows versions, should work on OS, should work on iPhones and Androids, etc. So what are those constraints? And it should be user-friendly. These should be captured in your user story. They could be called as non-functional requirements, or you can put them as acceptance criteria, but you should annotate your user story with these constraints. The other point the last point that I would like to talk about is user stories must be closed. Now, what does it mean? Closed and open. It's just like this. For example, as an admin, if I'm having a website called Benzene, as an admin, I would like to manage my website. Now, a user should feel a sense of accomplishment when they see the functionality. That's what I say. The user story should be closed. When I say I want to manage my website, what are the things that I want to manage? There are a lot of other activities, right? It means I want to add something, delete something, update something, record something, put some policies into it. A lot of other things I want to do with my website, prevent fraud, etc. So if I have to say as an admin of Benzene website, I want to manage my website so that I track the views or the hits, it becomes really big. So to keep it closed, I would want to slice it and say, okay, as a user, I would like to delete XYZ data, so that as a user, I want to amend my website and add a new banner. So those are closed stories. Ensure your stories are closed. So these are a few things that you have to bear in mind. The characteristics of user stories, what makes a user story great. You'll see how do you generate the user stories. So that takes us to the next topic.
So there is a question which Preetpal has mentioned. Sujit, if you can go to the previous slide. Previous slide. Yeah, one more. No, previous slide.
Let me just take what's the question. Is there any significant type of a user story? Yeah, type of a user story. See, for example, there are two types of user stories if you look at SAFe model. One is the actual customer facing user stories. Then you have non-functional user stories or exploratory user stories. So what kind of, and many times in the product backlog, Preetpal, you would see these kind of user stories. So that's why I would mention, okay, is it a spike or an enabler or an exploratory user story, or is it a customer facing user story? That's the differentiation over there, which you see on the picture.
Yeah. So, but also I think Sudha, what Preetpal mentioned was the type of user stories that you have written, search, workflow. I think that's only for segregation, right? It's only for segregation. There is no difference.
Absolutely. To make your life easier, you want to keep track of, okay, which workflow does it belong to, or is it a payment epic?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, that's what I was looking for, because we are doing such segregation. For example, the reporting type user stories. So we are segregating, we are tagging them as a reporting type. So, okay, fine. Thanks.
No worries. Is there any other question?
No, Sudha, we can move ahead.
Yes.
And we have exactly 30 minutes left. So
That's it. I will do it.
I'm also
So,
with that.
yeah, I just see your message now. Good to see you here. All right. Let's go to the next one. So having talked about the user stories, good user stories, how do you generate user stories? How do you ensure your user stories are great? How do you, or do you mindlessly go about creating user stories as and when you see the requirements or as and when you brainstorm? So the crux of a user story, as I mentioned, is the user. How do you find who is your user? So the user role modeling technique that we're going to talk about helps you identify user roles for a particular product. Now, going back to what is a role? We all know what roles are, but if you look at the definition, it says set of users or set of individuals or group of individuals who perform the same tasks. All of the groups, the entire group performs the same task. And if they perform in the same task, we'll put them under one particular role. So that is called as a user role. So let's see, how do you identify user roles? Now, when do you do it? Do it is the question. Probably in your sprint zero, when the product is going to be developed. In your discovery session, you could have it. At the beginning of every release, when you want to identify better and more number of user stories for a particular epic or a feature, you could do this user role modeling. Yeah, it can be done anytime just to enrich your stories and also to identify more stories. So what are the steps for role modeling, user role modeling? I'll just take you to the Miro board. I would like to give you an example of a job site. We all know about job sites like Naukri. Yeah, we search for jobs, and probably we also post jobs, the recruiters or Benzene, or else we post jobs as well, right? So that's the product that we want to build. I'm taking over the screen from Sujit. Share screen, yeah. So this is an example. I'm going to talk about it very quickly. So for this job search and posting website, we have multiple users. So we all can relate to this. That's why I've taken this example. This is a common example that will allow us to be on the same page. So Mike, who wants to change a job, is looking for a job. Somebody who's laid off from a job will be looking for a job. Somebody who's already in a job, but then wants a job in his hometown and his city. That's another kind of a user who's going to look for a job. Somebody who's a fresher need not be a college graduate, but fresh at work, probably 28-year-old, who probably was running a business and now wants to get into a job, corporate job, would also look for jobs. Then you have college graduates. Then we have HRs from a particular organization who are posting jobs, the vacancies in the organizations. Then we have recruiters who will be posting jobs from various other firms. Then we have somebody who just goes through the resumes posted. They're called resume readers. Then somebody who wants to get notification. They're not searching for jobs, but they just want these pop-ups every time a new job meeting this criteria comes up in the market. Then we have the admin for the website who's going to take care of the jobs being posted and getting rid of some comments, XYZ. Yeah, that's your admin guy. Then Ned, who is a part-timer who's only looking for X number of hours to work. Then a full-timer called Nile, who is going to look for full-time jobs. Now, these are the various users we have. Now, creating a story for Mike, Mark, and Mac would be difficult. Instead, let's see if we can group them under different user roles. So individuals are going to do the same things. So what do we do? First step is for user role modeling. Once you've identified the people who are going to use the product, how they're going to be impacted, or what are the various interactions they're going to have with the system, just like the way we did, we're going to put the roles for them by conducting a brainstorming session. So everybody comes together, you give us sticky notes, let them sit for 5 to 10 minutes, think about all the possible roles, think about the names and associate them with roles, and let them push all the roles that come to their mind for 15 minutes with the time box given. Once you come up with the roles, which is the first step, you start organizing your roles in your second step. So what have I done here? So here I've come up with in my first step, college student, a fresher. All these guys share common qualities. So I put them under the roles. So we have a college student, fresher, part-timer, full-timer, etc. We have a job poster, resume reader, recruiter. Now I want to find out if there are certain roles which are overlapping. Do they share same characteristics? Is there any relationship between the roles? So what I've done is college student and fresher. Yeah, for me, I know that they have overlapping characteristics. They're going to search for the same type of, they're going to search the same way. Their goal is the same. So I'm going to merge them together. Yeah, part-timer is completely different. Only few hours, and probably his her goals or perspective will be different, or conditions would be different. Then we have a full-timer. Experienced guy and a full-timer could be, yeah, they may share the same characteristics. Similarly, the laid off person also might share the same characteristics. That means the search criteria could be the same. The way they approach the website will be the same. The kind of people we are dealing with, probably they're experts with the software, right? Or they're experts in searching using the right search criteria. So these are the common characteristics that we identified. So we group them. That's the organizing. Then we have so many roles. Then do we have to write story for each of them? We don't have to. So what we can do is, I'm just getting rid of the pop-ups there. We'll consolidate. Now consolidating is, if there are any overlapping roles, we'll get rid of them. Here, these two are overlapping. So I got rid of them and I said, okay, we'll just have a fresher, a user story for a fresher. Then we have part-timer. Part-timer doesn't fit with anybody. So let's have a user role for a part-timer. All these guys share similar characteristics. In future, if there's something different, we can add it later on. But for now, let's keep the experienced user role. If you look at this one, job poster and resume reader, recruiter will post the jobs, recruiter will read the jobs as well. Certain characteristics are matching. So recruiter will also be a job poster, recruiter will also be a resume reader. So I don't want these two. Instead, I'll create a user role with all the attributes and keep it as a recruiter user role. That's what I've done. Admin, totally different goals, totally different ways of managing the website. So his interactions with the system will be different. So I want a user story to solve admin's problem. So I'll keep the admin user role as it is. The next step, could you come back, please? Oh, sorry, I'll stop sharing. You there, Sujit?
Yes, Sudha. I'll share my screen.
Yeah, I think you can share the screen.
Just a quick time check, Sudha.
Yes, 7:10. I'm done. Don't worry. Okay, I'll take it over. All right, you take it. So once that is done, what we have to do is we have to define some attributes for them. What kind of a user, how many hours in a day this user is going to use the particular. We are at the fourth step. We'll define the user roles and create attributes. What this role, admin guy, how many hours in a day is he going to spend time with the system, with the website? Is he very proficient? Is he or she very proficient with the software? Okay. These kind of characteristics should be captured for the user roles. Now that takes us to the next step, which is a persona, right? Refining the user roles, adding more information to find out what are the various interactions, what are the feelings of the user is our next step. From there, we can move on to another technique, or you can stick to user role modeling, where you can do the same there, or you can use the personas. Persona technique takes you one step ahead. Here, you just saw the names. I want to give an expression. I want to empathize with the user. I want to know more about the user. So to brainstorm in different ways and to understand the other pain points or the problematic areas or the happy areas for the user I'm targeting, I will give a name to the user. I will also add a picture to the user. So this is an imaginary representation of the user roles that we've created. That's called as a persona. So it goes beyond a name and a picture. So we would want to add details like, what is his job? Okay, he's a computer savvy. He's an IT guy. He's a QA. So he knows about the system. So he would want a system which functions this way. That's kind of the thought processes get triggered when you write these kind of details. What is the goal that you're solving for this particular persona? So this particular guy, John, wants to learn new courses, but he wants to attend webinars. He wants to take up the blogs and then do some learning by himself by looking at the videos and earn some PDUs. That's the goal of the particular user, John. So based on the John's needs, we will build the website. So that's the whole point in thinking along the lines of a persona. When you think along the lines of persona, you are able to generate better user stories. You're able to generate user stories which actually target the customer needs. So this takes us to the next topic, another technique, which is impact mapping. Now, this is also a really important, I would say, an interesting technique which you could use in your sprint zero or in your discovery session. This comes from design thinking concept, wherein we diverge a lot. We think about all possible areas for users, all possible pain points for users, capture all the relevant user stories based on the understanding we get from the persona by empathizing with the persona. And then we converge back and then start writing user stories. So if you're doing already all of this, then why impact mapping? That's the question I'm going to answer. Why impact mapping? Yes, we wrote mindlessly or mindfully a lot of requirements. Now, how many of these requirements are actually solving the customer's problem? Okay, we are solving the problem, but you lose sight of what was the actual problem. What is the actual goal of the product? What was the objective that we have to meet? When we write the requirements, when we write user stories, there could be times when we lose sight of the big picture. So to help us focus on the goal of the product, we use impact mapping technique. Along with that, we may have multiple user stories targeting multiple users. Figuring out which user story adds more value, which user story is of higher importance or more important to the customer, this tool will help us identify that. And this can be used again anywhere during release planning or sprint zero. Also, it will help you to visualize the features and which are aligned to the goal. So these are the reasons why you would want to use an impact mapping. Now let's see how to use impact mapping. That takes us to the next slide, wherein we talk about 4 steps. Now, these 4 steps, mind you, are very important, and these are sequential. They have to be performed in a sequence. It's not just about identifying a persona and writing a user story in the form of as and I want to, but it is also about keeping ourselves aligned to the user goal or the goal of the product. So the first question that you have to answer in your collaborative session or in your workshop is bring everybody together, your product owner, business stakeholders, business analysts, developers, and figure out the bigger picture. Why are we doing it? What is the organization going to get out of it? That's the why part. And the why part should be smart, very specific. I want to increase my revenue to 100K by end of this particular year. So smart goals, very specific, measurable, 100K, relevant. Yes, this is my overall corporate strategy that we have, increasing the revenue from all different angles. Time bound by end of this year. That user goals should be smart. Once we capture the why, we move on to the second step. Now, who are the people who are going to be impacted by the goal? So how do you frame this question for you all to understand? The best way is to figure out who are the people who are going to interact with the system. So if I were to increase hits on my website, the people who are going to increase the hits or the views on my website would be people like me, people like you who will come to read our blogs, who will come to see our videos, people like me who are going to post the videos and post the blogs, and benzene admin guys who are going to manage the website. So these people are going to be the users who are going to be impacted. Along with that, we may have another team who is focusing on some regulatory guidelines. Yeah, even those guys are the actors or the personas, I would say. That takes us to the next part. Once we identify the who part, once we identify the who part, we have to figure out how are these guys going to help us achieve the goal. So what are the various outcomes? What outcomes will come out of it so that we know that we met the goal? Now, again, how do you come to how part? Just figure out what is that Sudha is going to do to increase the hits on the website. So I'm going to put blogs, I'm going to put videos, I'm going to probably also put some questionnaires. Then what are you guys going to do? You're going to visit the website, work on the questionnaire, chat with us. Yeah. So these are the things that you're going to do. What are the things that actors are going to do? Start doing something or stop doing something or do something differently to increase my hits or the views. This is the how part. Now from the how part, you get the what part. So I want to write blogs. So writing blogs, putting videos, putting XYZ, all these are my deliverables. So to get to the deliverables or the user stories, you have to perform the preceding steps, the how, the who, and the why. Now let's look at a simple example before I get a time check. This one, if you take a look, another example, I want, instead of just writing user stories, I first figure out what is my goal. I want to reduce the hotel check-in time. This is a common problem we face. We go into hotel, we wait for like 15, 20 minutes for a room, right? Or an hour sometimes. I want to decrease the hotel check-in time. So who are the people who are going to use the check-in functionality? It'll be the customers like you and me. It'll be the hotel staff. Okay, these will be the actors. I've identified the actors. The next question, how are the customers? What is that the customer will do to reduce the check-in time? If the customer has some kind of a code on his mobile, he'll be able to check in, which he'll punch in, he'll be able to check in faster. If the customer gets a scan code on his phone, he'll be able to check in faster. So these are the behaviors or the interactions the customer will have with the system that you're developing. Those are the how part. Similarly, the hotel staff, probably you will automate some tasks. You will provide more counters in the hotel. So these are the various other activities for the hotel staff. From there, you will start developing the user stories. You probably want to build an app for an iPhone, for an iPad. You will also want to build some improved booking system, an automated booking system, and provide some terminals with extra software. So these are my deliverables or the user stories. So how am I going to write a user story using this example? As a customer, I would like to create an app on my iPhone so that this portion, impact portion, so that I'm able to check in using my scan code. I'm able to create, as a customer, I want to be able to create an app for my iPad, etc., so that I'm able to check in using my iPad. That's how user stories get generated. So the focus is, whenever you're writing user stories, if you do not have the user in place, there are high chances that you might miss out on your business needs. So impact mapping is one such tool which will help you keep the focus on the goal of the product. Now that brings to the end of this impact mapping topic. Any questions, gentlemen, ladies? Okay. So Sujit, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sudha. So everyone, now that we've understood the personas, impact mapping, and the way we approach writing a user story, we also wanted to give emphasize on when do we write a user story and what stage, right? We understand, although the user story writing is a continuous approach, continuous activity. When we start usually a project or a product, we do something called as a discovery session, and we reach out to this artifact you see on the board, which is called as a story map. So this is the starting point of writing a user story. A story map is an activity in a discovery session. I'm just going to give it for a brief about this for your reference. It's a 3-step journey where we first identify the user journey and the phases of user journey. So that each and every stage or phase in a user journey becomes our epics. The next phase is to drill down into each and every phase. Now that we have identified the epics, for us, next activity or next phase in the discovery session is to identify what all capabilities under that step or phase of a user journey are we looking at providing. So that will give you the list of features, which is nothing but the capabilities under that epic. The third phase is getting deep into each and every feature. With respect to this feature or capability, what all can a user do? Right? We brainstorm, we have a discussion, we have divergence discussion, and note down all the activities or user actions which we need to provide or which we think we should provide for under that feature. So once this bi-directional map is ready, this is when you start converting all these yellow tickets into user stories. I'm also going to show you a reference sample here for an email managing app. Organizing email, manage calendar, manage contacts. So these are epics or the phase or a customer journey. Under each phase or an epic, we have capabilities. For example, manage email have compose email, read email, and delete email as capabilities. Under compose email, we have so many things which a user can start doing. So once you have this bi-directional story map, all these yellow tickets gets converted into a unidirectional list, which is called as the product backlog itself. I hope this is clear. Taking you all to the next topic, which is a few anti-patterns of user story writing. During a course of engagement with any customers or coaching, we come across few anti-patterns which we generally try to tell or educate people on avoiding them. First one is not focusing on persona, need, or action. We've seen a lot of teams writing login story or phone number login story or search story, right? The moment you start doing that, there's no context to that. The development team need to understand what's the persona we're building the story for, and what's the need and what is the action. Of course, as a delivery partner, I want to log in using phone number so that I can keep track of my deliverables. Gives the development team more context than just saying phone number login, isn't it? So please do focus on providing the context with persona, need, and action in your user stories. The second one, uh, we've also seen teams writing huge stories, right, which may take even 4 or 5 sprints to deliver, right? And imagine explaining that huge story to the team itself, right? A, you're spending too much time explaining to the team. B, the team is not absorbing what you're explaining. C, with that huge story, you're not able to deliver faster and get faster feedback. So this is something which you might want to avoid when you're writing a user story. We also have a blog on how to split a user story on our website. Please do refer that. Next, the third one is we do have this habits of giving our leads or architects to write the user story. So generally, when you give your user story writing to the development team, they get into solutioning part of it, or they use technical terms like this API should be here, this response should be like this, right? When you talk about a user story, it's more from a requirement perspective, and the product owner, being the customer face or the user face, is the right person to write a user story which talks about this is the requirement, right? Try to avoid that as well. The next one is writing separate stories based on skill set. Development, UI development story, or a testing story, backend story. So these are the stories which usually we've seen teams creating based on skill set or based on people. So what happens is the moment you develop a login API backend story and you give a demo, that's not used by that's not used by a user. That cannot be used because it's just an API. Always remember, a user story has to be developed, test, and at the end of the sprint or at the end of 2 sprints, it has to be used, or it must be in a working state where people can give feedback for us. People like product owner or even the users. So always do not divide your user story based on skill set. Rather, go with vertical slicing based on the acceptance criteria, roles, based on the platforms, etc. And another anti-pattern which we've seen generally is telling how to implement it. We've seen a lot of product team writing user stories by telling that this is how we have to implement. Now, as Sudha mentioned, a user story is a conversation striker, right? Moment you go with one solution, or the other way, when you try to have a conversation, the development team can come up with a lot of solutions which is more feasible, which might be more less time consuming, right? So always go with the requirement, just the requirement, and let the development team analyze it and then come up with multiple solutions. Later, we can maybe take a call on picking up which is best for us. So rather than telling how to implement it in a user story, it's always better to tell what the requirement is or what the how and what part is. So these are the few anti-patterns my team we generally recommend to avoid while writing a user stories. And thank you so much, Alok. I'll leave it to you.
Sure. So with this,
Next slide, please. Please go to the previous slide and leave it there. Yeah.
Sure. So, first of all, if any of one of you have any queries around the webinar topics, please feel free to probably, raise your hand and we'll be more than happy to take them up. This cohort has been very silent. So, either we think that everything that was explained has been understood perfectly, or if there are any questions, please do feel free to ask. This is a QR code for you to leave feedback on Benzene.